I'm Katherine G. McRae, and this is Perspective. My guest today is Jessica Bolduc, and we're talking about willful blindness. Jessica, can you just tell our viewing audience a little bit about your background and the different organizations that you are involved with?
Yeah, sure. Bonjour, Ani, everyone. My name is Jess, and I'm a member of the Batchewana First Nation, so I first and foremost wanted to recognize that because we're here on Anishinaabe territory and also the territory of the historical Métis community here in Sault Ste. Marie. I am the executive director of an organization called the 4 Hours Youth Movement, and we do work around truth and reconciliation in Canada. I also do a lot of youth organizing with awesome young people all across the country, and so shout outs to the YSI Collaborative, who has a presence here in Sault Ste. Marie and also Northern Ontario. I am on the board of Turtle Island Institute, as well as Thinking Rock Community Arts, which is also an organization that's based here in Algoma.
You're one heck of a busy lady. I know that, and you always seem to be traveling quite a bit too. Today we decided to talk about willful blindness. It's just one of the many, many topics that you're very well versed in to speak about. Willful blindness, what does that mean?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. When you invited me on the show and you asked me, is there a hot topic or something that you wanted to talk about? I thought about it for a lot because there are many issues. In particular, there's many different issues that face Indigenous people here on Turtle Island and in Canada, but I thought it's actually important for us maybe to stop to think, to reframe that to, what is actually the challenge that we're facing? A friend of mine, her name is Tanchai Redvers, and she and her brother started an organization called We Matter, which works on life promotion and suicide prevention for Indigenous youth. She says, Indigenous people don't have problems. Canada has problems. And so I think that it's willful blindness helps us to kind of reframe that. So the concept of willful blindness is a legal term, so many people may be familiar with it. It's this idea that, I'm sorry, officer, I didn't know that the speed limit was only 70 and I was going 130. Oops, sorry. So in a court of law, a claim of I didn't know doesn't hold up. It doesn't excuse you from the harm that you may have caused for the wrong that you did.
Unfortunately, I know that as a fact with speeding tickets, but anyhow.
Exactly. So that's the example that I wanted to use in sort of this idea of willful blindness as being something that's about ignorance. And we can claim to be ignorant about something, but it doesn't excuse us from how the impacts that we might have in our behaviors on whatever that would be. So to me, a conversation about willful blindness is an interesting one because I think that, in Canada, as Canadians generally, we do have a lot of privilege. And there are things that we get to be willfully blind to, even though we as a country or as citizens who are part of a country actually can contribute to some of the negative impacts of things. And so, yeah, so it's just like something that was curious to me is to think about the ways in which a concept like willful blindness actually applies to how we get stuck in these patterns of, I think, behavior, whether that's political or societal, that continues to oppress some while others are sort of uplifted and thrive in community.
Could you give an example, Jessica, to demonstrate willful blindness?
Yeah, I feel like by show of hands, that doesn't work here. I speak a lot in like audiences and things, but on Monday or Sunday night, many Canadians were out celebrating Canada Day. For many Indigenous people, the celebration of Canada Day is actually very hurtful because the celebration of a nation that has historically and continues to develop policies and implement policies that impact Indigenous people in extremely negative ways. And I think that that's something to be thinking about. And so, why are you celebrating, or what are you celebrating? So it's like we're willfully blind to some of the things that Canada needs to improve, but we'll if we don't experience those things ourselves, then it's very easy for us to not do anything about it, or to sort of live our lives in a bubble of comfort. Canada Day is an example to me that is really interesting. Another one that I could give is there was a woman who climbed the Statue of Liberty in the United States, and she was part of a group that was protesting some of the policies around immigration, in particular ICE and the removal of children from their families. And there was a woman who was there who just sort of was upset because her vacation was ruined because she had to leave the island. And so, yeah, so it's like she doesn't experience the impacts of what that person was doing. She's willfully blind to how
she's in her own bubble,
yeah,
basically.
Yeah.
We need to go to break, and we'll be right back. You're watching Perspective. Please stay with us. Welcome back. This is Perspective. I'm Katherine G. McRae, and my guest today is Jessica Bolduc. Before the break, Jessica, we were talking about willful blindness. You gave a couple of examples of that. What contributes to willful blindness in today's society?
I think that like our identities really contribute to that, and that when we don't experience things the same as others, we may not sort of be able to understand or empathize with them. So the things that contribute to us being ignorant of other people's experiences include our gender, include our race, include our social status, whether we're living in a different part of the country, so whether we're rural or we're in an urban city. So these experiences that we have really shape the ways in which that we view and we look at the world, and also how we interact with others. And so willful blindness is also really connected to like our privileges, and the people who have privileges in our communities oftentimes come from sort of dominant experiences. And so if you think about like what would a community that's completely inclusive for folks with disabilities look like? If you have people who are in positions of power who've never had a relationship with a person with a disability or have one themselves, so they are blind to the experiences of those people and therefore can make decisions that actually can impact negatively on that person's life.
Hence the reason for having diversity in culture, gender, and every other which way on governing boards and governance and in government.
Yeah, 100%. I think I keep giving examples of the United States, but the fact that there is decisions being made on women's reproductive rights by a group of men is a huge red flag to me. Is a huge red flag for me. But if I put that into the context of Canada, and we look at the political makeup in our municipality here in Sault Ste. Marie, or even within Canada, although it's getting more diverse, you have a lot of people who come from a wealthier class, people who are white older gentlemen, and so the realities of a community are shaped in favor of those people's experiences.
And on average, I mean, people go about their lives in their own little bubble and their own experience and familiarity and their own circles of, friends and family. Getting back to the disability issue in this municipality and others, I never realized how inaccessible the city is until I was looking after a woman in a wheelchair and realized I could not move her around very, very easily. But up until that point, I wasn't really aware of how difficult it is.
Yeah, and so, I mean, in some senses, like you, in not standing up and being an ally to disability movements, we're willfully blind to that if we don't have those experiences, and we choose, our actions reinforce a status quo. Exactly. And then that's sort of the challenge with or the sort of call to action with willful blindness is like, let's be aware of those things that we have, the biases that we have, because they actually create exclusion in our communities.
Absolutely. We'll be right back. We're going to break. Please stay with us. You're watching Perspective. Welcome back. You're watching Perspective. My guest today is Jessica Bolduc, and we're talking about willful blindness. Before the break, Jessica, we were talking about some examples of people living in their bubbles in their own lives and not realizing what other people go through if they haven't had personal firsthand experience. What can individuals do to be more aware of their own willful blindness and maybe take some action to overcome that?
Yeah, I think it's like part of it is not necessarily what, I mean, a piece is what people can do, but a bigger piece is sort of just an awareness of the places in which that you are ignorant or willfully blind and carry biases or live your life in a way that's shaped by the beliefs that you have. That
So many people aren't even aware of what they're not aware of. So how can individuals become more aware of their own blind spots?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? Because it requires people to actually like work on themselves and be self-reflective, which is I think why I wanted to talk a little bit about this, because oftentimes we point the finger at everyone else when we're looking at a big issue, and a lot of these issues are very systemic and they're very huge. So I think of climate change, for example, and an individual person might say to themselves, well, what can I really do about climate change? As an individual, as a person, as maybe a single mom who's got a big family, I know how it is to have to buy groceries or things and make conscious consumer choices. But if we're turning our attention to the decisions that we make every day, we can reveal those things for ourselves.
A lot of times people will say, oh, the areas are so huge. And people will think, well, there's nothing I can do. I'm just one little person. Like, what can I do? I can't save the world. I hear this all the time from people, because the issues are so huge. Sometimes people will choose to do nothing because they feel they can't make an impact.
Yeah, and I mean, like, if you think of willful blindness in fractals, like, that's like an exact example of that. It's like, well, I'm not directly responsible, or I'm not directly impacting these things, so it doesn't matter the decisions that I make in my life. And so what I think that we're called on as a society is to start to like actually question those things in and of ourselves. Is like, everything that I do in my life every day, can I just change one other thing that actually might help me to understand another person's perspective differently? Can I make a choice about the things I buy, or how I buy them, or where I buy them, that can just shift or change one little tiny thing? Because,
and again, there's value in your purse or wallet in money. Mm-hmm. And what you spend your money on sends a signal to the manufacturer of that product.
Yeah, and we live in such a society that is so driven by consumption that it blinds us to the real impacts of things like climate change or child labor in the different countries that we happen to be buying our clothes from. So I understand education and being educated is also a privilege for some people to have access to that information. But I think if we make conscious efforts to try to live our lives in different ways, that's actually what we're called upon right now in society. Is to think about living our lives different ways rather than continuing to like hash out the issues, because we've done so many like researches and studies on different kinds of hot topic issues in the country. What hasn't changed, I think, is how we behave and how we as individuals change the way that we behave and the attitudes that we have towards these issues that will shift them.
Okay. We have to go to another break, and we'll be right back. Please stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Katherine G. McRae. You're watching Perspective. My guest today is Jessica Bolduc, and we're talking about willful blindness. Jessica, before the break, we were talking about some different examples of willful blindness and what people can do, or what should they do to create more awareness in their own lives. We've talked about climate change a little bit, or climate affecting the climate when the products that they buy. What else can people do?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I was thinking about willful blindness is because I work in the context of reconciliation here in Canada, and reconciliation, the way that we define it, is about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people as a starting point for us to move forward on some of the challenges that Indigenous people face in our communities. And so, to me, for like listeners here, I guess I'm thinking about like, what are the things locally that we're actually willfully blind to, and then what would change if we arose our awareness around those things? An example that I can give around that is that Sault Ste. Marie is one of the locations of one of the residential schools that existed in Canada, and that location of that school is actually on the university campus. And the amount of times that I've seen people taking their wedding photos outside of the church that was built by children as young as 6 years old, to imagine what that couple's experience would have been differently if they weren't blind to the history that was right in front of them, to the faculty, to the students that go to that university. How would their experience change, and how would they respect or interact with the Indigenous communities here locally differently if they were to educate themselves on place and on land and where they are?
How do you encourage people to educate themselves, though? Like in a selfie, instant gratification society, how do you encourage people to look behind the scenes to see what was there before they were there, to even think about a time before their own present moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we try to do that work with what I do with the 4 Hours Youth Movement, and it's like, I can't make you want to change. I can just only hope that you will want to change yourself. But what I can offer is a place for conversation. Relationship building is such a crucial piece of what is so important in the world right now, I think, in order for us to understand the differences that we actually need to celebrate. Diversity is a part of a healthy ecosystem, and so the diversity needs to be celebrated, and we need to figure out how to live within it. People first have to want to change, and so that's.
And how do you open someone's mind and awareness to diversity and history in the first place? How would you go about doing that?
Like for me, education is key, and so the work that teachers are doing and the work that people are doing in popular education and just educating within like organizations or businesses and things like that, people can be doing that so that people can learn. And beyond that, it's like individuals have agency to do these things. There's so much information that exists on the internet that it shouldn't be an excuse for people not to know about whose land they're on, who came before, and how we as Anishinaabe people experience being in Sault Ste. Marie when at one time this land was like a very important gathering place for like our communities. So like just stopping to pause and to consider that the reality or what they experience in the world might be different than what someone else's is. It's a very hard question. People ask me, what can I do? And it's like, I shouldn't actually have to tell you what to do.
We need to encourage people to use that gray matter between their ears for more than just selfie taking.
Yeah.
We need to go to break.
Okay.
Jessica, we'll be right back. You're watching Perspective. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Perspective. I'm Katherine G. McRae with my guest Jessica Bolduc, and we're talking about willful blindness. Jessica, what can people do to raise their own awareness in this selfie society that we live in, this instant gratification and an attention span of a gnat that everybody has today? What can we do to increase awareness and take positive actions?
I think that like what we're called upon as a society is to like move away from a culture of like individual isolation to one that thinks more in wholeness of community. And so,
But today we're more isolated than ever, even though we're connected online. Everyone's really in their own bubble, in their own isolation.
yeah, and it's a huge problem, right? I mean, not like globally we have like suicide epidemics that are happening. We see mental health as being also something that so many different people are dealing with. One, because it's being spoken about more, which is really great. But there's also the rates of mental health are increasing in ways that to me are alarming. And so like we actually need to like push back against those things for ourselves. And that might mean going and picking up the phone and talking to someone versus sending them a text. I mean, we're kind of moving away from this idea of willful blindness, but willful blindness is all connected into like this broader context of a culture of me before them. And you see the ways in which that is bubbling up in the way that we talk about and treat newcomers to our communities, despite being willfully blind to the history of Canada, which was settled by immigrants, or the United States as an entire group of immigrants unless you are Indigenous to these lands. And so the hypocrisy that is within the decisions and the judgments that we make on people because we're willfully blind of our history has consequences on people's lives. And so like, what can we do? We can just learn about other people's stories.
So there's a huge piece of that is ignorance. It's just based on ignorance, lack of knowledge, and learning about your own history, your own culture, and the history of the country that you live in.
Yeah, and I mean, ignorance is a hard word, and people don't like to sort of consider themselves as ignorant, nor do people like to consider themselves as racist. But the foundations of some of our systems were built on racism, and therefore we've been absorbed into systems that allow us to perpetuate that racism, even if we don't know, even if we're ignorant to that.
Evolve as human beings to become more aware and more caring and considerate and create a better world for everyone, not just ourselves, but for everyone. How can human beings do that? How can people in Sault Ste. Marie do that?
Well, I mean, there's many different people who are working globally around this idea of like, what is the future that we're trying to create, and what are the thought processes and the methodologies and all of these kinds of blurby, jargony words. But fundamentally at the core of a lot of these theories of how we change the world are Indigenous worldviews and practices. And so to me, that may be hard to connect that back up to what people can do here in Sault Ste. Marie, but it's actually about investing in the resurgence of Indigenous knowledge bases. And valuing that knowledge, valuing the languages that were almost made extinct here in Canada as actually a possible solution for how we can then live in the world. Because the worldview of Canada was shaped on the foundation of colonialism. And if we, which really is about also a deep connection into resource extraction and economic development. And so if the foundation of a country was built on that rather than something that was around sharing and the importance of family and community at the center, over and above anything about profits or anything like that, then we can really shift a lot of the ways in which that we look and we view and we experience the world around us.
So if you could leave our audience with a parting thought or even a call to action to create a better world, not only for themselves, but everyone around them, what would that be, Jessica?
I mean, it's like, what might you be willfully blind to, and what impacts might that have on people around you? And also to call on people to, I have a friend who climbed Mount Everest, and he said, you don't, and he calls that as like, when you need to eat an elephant, you don't just go and try to eat the whole thing. An elephant is huge. You eat it one bite at a time. And so to me, the power of the small actions that we can do every day actually can make a lot of difference. And then if we do that within community, small actions that are amplified by the actions of a community that we create that acts in a different way, then like all of a sudden we've got a revolution, maybe.
Okay, so get off your cell phone and get out in the world and get face-to-face with people and learn about people in this country and the people around you right in this city. I want to thank you today, Jessica, for joining me. Jessica Bolduc, who has a very long career and active in the community and beyond, and trying to make Sault Ste. Marie a better place as well as worldwide. Thank you so much, Jessica, for joining me today. You're watching Perspective. Till next time, I'm Katherine G. McRae. What's your perspective?